Christmas Eve, and I was dying in an alley, sold like cattle, abandoned like trash. The man who'd ordered me as a bride took one look and turned away. My money? Stolen. My hope? Gone. I hadn't eaten in 3 days when 2 men found me in the dark, and they weren't there to help. I thought that was how my story would end, cold, hungry, and forgotten. Then a wagon rolled into that alley, and a cowboy's voice cut through the darkness. "Get up, you're coming home." I didn't know it then, but those 4 words would change everything. If you want to know how a woman with nothing became everything to a family that needed her just as much, stay with me until the end. And when you're done, hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. The heat of late summer in Wyoming had a particular quality to it, dry and relentless, the kind that baked the earth until it cracked and made breathing feel like swallowing dust. Even as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the air shimmered with residual warmth, clinging to skin and clothes like an unwelcome memory. Marion Cross sat behind the Silver Spur Inn, with her back pressed against the rough wooden planks of the building, her carpet bag clutched to her chest like a shield. The bag contained everything she owned in the world: 2 dresses, a hairbrush with several missing bristles, a tin cup, and a small Bible her mother had given her before the fever took her. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Or at least it had been. Now even that felt uncertain. 3 days. 3 days since she'd stepped off the train with her heart hammering against her ribs, scanning the platform for the face she'd only seen in a single daguerreotype. 3 days since Silas Pemberton had taken one long look at her and said, "No, this won't do." Marion closed her eyes against the memory, but it played behind her eyelids anyway, vivid and cruel. She'd been wearing her best dress, or what passed for best when you'd been a seamstress's assistant in Philadelphia with barely enough income to keep body and soul together. The fabric was clean, if worn thin at the elbows. Her hair had been pinned carefully beneath her bonnet. She'd practiced her smile in the train's small mirror, trying to look pleasant, hopeful, worthy. Silas Pemberton hadn't cared about any of that. He was a prosperous merchant, the letter had said, looking for a wife of good character and reasonable appearance to manage his household. The arrangement had been made through an agency, everything proper, everything documented. Marion had signed papers, paid fees she could barely afford, and traveled nearly 2,000 miles on the promise of a new life. "You're older than the photograph suggested," Silas had said, his voice flat and dismissive. "And thinner. I was promised a woman of robust constitution." Marion had stood there on the platform, her single bag at her feet, while other passengers flowed around them like water around stones. "I'm 26, like," she'd managed to say, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "The photograph was taken only 6 months ago, and I'm quite healthy, I assure you. The arrangement is canceled." Silas had already been turning away. "I'll speak to the agency about a refund of my fees." "But," Marion had reached out, not quite touching his sleeve. "Mr. Pemberton, please. I've traveled so far. If you'd just give me a chance." "I've made my decision." He'd glanced at her then, and the coldness in his eyes had made her step back. "The agency will handle the matter of your return. Good day." And he'd left. Simply walked away and climbed into a waiting carriage while Marion stood frozen on the platform, her entire future crumbling around her like ash. She should have gotten back on the train right then. Should have used what little money she had left to purchase a ticket back east, back to the cramped boarding house and the endless stream of mending and alterations that had barely kept her fed. Should have accepted defeat and retreated. But something in her had refused. Maybe it was pride, foolish, stubborn pride that insisted she shouldn't have to slink back like a kicked dog. Maybe it was desperation, the knowledge that Philadelphia held nothing for her anymore except poverty and loneliness. Or maybe it was simply exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of fighting so hard for so long only to be rejected once again. So she'd taken her bag and walked into town, looking for somewhere to stay while she figured out what to do next. The Silver Spur Inn had seemed reasonable enough. The building was weathered but solid, with a painted sign that showed only modest peeling. Marion had climbed the front steps and approached the desk, where a heavy-set woman with steel-gray hair was recording entries in a ledger. "I need a room, please," Marion had said. "Just for a few nights." The woman had looked up, her eyes sweeping over Marion in a single assessing glance. "That'll be $1.50 per night, in advance." Marion had reached for the small purse tucked inside her carpet bag and found nothing. Her hands had moved frantically, searching every pocket and fold of fabric. The purse had been there on the train. She'd checked it just before arriving, counting her remaining funds. $8.35. Enough for a few nights' lodging and meals while she sorted out her options. Now it was gone. Marion's voice had cracked. "I had money. In my bag. Someone must have taken it when you weren't looking?" The woman's tone had held no sympathy. "Happens all the time to folks fresh off the train. Thieves can spot easy marks a mile away." "Please." Marion had gripped the edge of the desk. "I'll find a way to pay you. I'm a skilled seamstress. I could work." "I don't need a seamstress. I need paying customers." The woman had already returned her attention to the ledger. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Henley sometimes takes on help in exchange for a bed. Otherwise, you're on your own." Marion had found the boarding house. Mrs. Henley had taken one look at her and said, "I already got 3 girls doing laundry and cleaning. Don't need another. Try the saloon. They're always looking for serving girls." The saloon had made Marion's skin crawl the moment she'd stepped inside. The proprietor, a man with yellowed teeth and wandering hands, had looked her over with an expression that made her stomach turn. "Pretty enough," he'd said. "Little thin, but some men like that. You ever done this kind of work before?" Marion had understood what kind of work he meant. She'd turned and walked out without answering. After that, she'd tried the general store, the livery stable, even the church. No one needed help. No one had work to offer. And without money, without references, without anyone to vouch for her, Marion was nobody. She was invisible. By the second day, hunger had set in. Real hunger, the kind that made her hands shake and her vision blur at the edges. She'd been hungry before, plenty of times, but always with the knowledge that eventually there would be something, even if just a crust of bread or a thin soup. Now there was nothing. She'd spent that night in an abandoned lean-to behind the blacksmith shop, her carpet bag as a pillow and her shawl as a blanket. Sleep had come in fits and starts, interrupted by the sounds of the town and the gnawing emptiness in her belly. On the 3rd day, she had returned to the Silver Spur Inn, hoping, though for what, she wasn't entirely sure. Maybe someone had turned in her purse. Maybe the woman at the desk would have had a change of heart. Instead, she'd found a spot behind the building where the late afternoon shade offered some respite from the heat. She'd sat down, meaning to rest for just a moment, to gather her strength and figure out her next move. But exhaustion had pulled at her like a tide, and she'd stayed. The sun was lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Beautiful, if she'd had the energy to appreciate it. Instead, Marion simply sat with her head tipped back against the wall, her eyes half closed, her body so heavy it felt like part of the earth itself. She should get up, should move, should do something. But what? Where? The question circled in her mind without answers, growing fainter as her consciousness began to drift. She didn't hear the footsteps at first, didn't register the voices until they were close enough that the words cut through her haze. "Told you, she's back here. Been sitting there all day like a lost sheep." Marion's eyes opened slowly. 2 figures stood at the mouth of the alley, silhouetted against the fading light. As they moved closer, details emerged. One was a younger man, unsteady on his feet, his shirt stained and his face flushed with drink. The other was older, better dressed, with the calculating expression of someone who made his living from other people's desperation. She recognized the older man. Franklin Morse, the agent who'd arranged her placement with Silas Pemberton. He'd seemed professional enough in their correspondence, but seeing him now in person, Marion felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Miss Cross," Morse said, his voice carrying false cheer. "I've been looking for you. Mr. Pemberton informed me of the unfortunate situation." Marion tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She managed to push herself a little straighter against the wall. "Mr. Morse, I was going to contact you about the return journey." "Oh, there's no need for that." Morse moved closer, and the younger man followed like a shadow. "In fact, I found a solution to everyone's problems." Something in his tone made Marion's skin prickle with warning. "What solution?" "This here is Tommy Vickers. He works at the cattle yards, and he's been looking for a wife. Morse gestured to the younger man, who was staring at Marion with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the wall. Now, I know the original arrangement didn't work out, but that doesn't mean we can't find you another placement. Tommy's willing to take you on. Not much of a dowry needed for a working man. I'm not looking for another arrangement, Marion said, her voice steadier than she felt. I just need— You need a husband, Morse interrupted. You need a home. That's what you came here for, isn't it? And Tommy's offering exactly that. Tommy Vickers lurched forward another step. Up close, Marion could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the way his eyes struggled to focus. She's prettier than you said, he slurred. Little skinny, but that's all right. I like 'em delicate. I'm not interested, Marion said firmly. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Vickers, but I'll find my own way. Your own way? Morse's false cheer dropped away, revealing something harder underneath. Look at you. You haven't got a cent to your name. No job, no prospects, nowhere to sleep. How long do you think you'll last out here on your own? That's not your concern. Actually, it is. Morse pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. You signed a contract, Miss Cross. An agreement to enter into marriage upon arrival in Wyoming. The contract doesn't specify which marriage, and Tommy here is willing to honor it. That contract was with Silas Pemberton, who has voided his portion of the agreement, but the agency's fees were paid, travel was arranged, and we delivered you as promised. You still owe us fulfillment of the contract. Or, he paused meaningfully, payment for services rendered. I believe the total comes to approximately $45, including the finder's fee. $45. It might as well have been $1,000. Marion's throat went dry. I don't have that kind of money. I know you don't, which is why Tommy's offer is so generous. Morse's smile was sharp. He'll pay your debt to the agency, give you a home, put food in your belly. All you have to do is be his wife. Seems like a fair trade, doesn't it? I said no. Tommy's hand shot out and gripped her arm, pulling her halfway to her feet. Don't be stupid. You got nothing. You are nothing. Take what you're being offered. Marion tried to pull away, but his grip was iron-strong despite the drink. Her carpetbag fell to the ground, spilling its meager contents into the dirt. Let go of me. You heard her. The voice came from behind them, calm and level, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need volume to be heard. All three of them froze. A wagon had rolled into the alley without any of them noticing, or maybe Marion had been too focused on the men in front of her to hear it approach. Now it stood between them and the street, blocking the exit. The man who'd spoken was climbing down from the driver's seat with the easy grace of someone accustomed to physical work. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dusty work clothes and a hat that shadowed his face. But even in the fading light, Marion could see the set of his jaw, the quiet intensity of his gaze as he assessed the situation. Behind him, in the wagon bed, 4 children sat in various stages of attention. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 13, had gone still and watchful. 2 younger boys flanked a small girl, all of them staring with wide eyes. This doesn't concern you, friend, Morse said, his voice tight. Private business. Doesn't look private. The stranger moved forward, his steps measured and deliberate. Looks like a lady asking to be left alone and not getting her wish. The lady has obligations. The lady said no. The stranger's tone hadn't changed, still calm, still level, but something in it made Tommy Vickers release Marion's arm and step back. I heard her say it twice. That seems pretty clear. Morse's face had gone red. Now see here. I see fine. The stranger bent and gathered Marion's belongings, placing them carefully back in her carpetbag. Then he straightened and looked directly at her for the first time. You got somewhere to go, miss? Marion's voice came out barely above a whisper. No. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something. Then he shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was warm from his body, and it smelled of leather and hay and honest work. Well, you do now. He offered his hand. Get up, you're coming home. For a moment, Marion could only stare at him. His face was weathered from sun and wind with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting at distant horizons. He wasn't young, somewhere in his 30s maybe, and he wasn't handsome in any conventional sense, but his eyes were kind and his hand was steady, and when she placed her palm in his grip was gentle but sure. He pulled her to her feet with no apparent effort, then kept his hand on her elbow to steady her when she swayed. "You can't just take her," Morse sputtered. "She has debts. Send me the bill." The stranger's attention never left Marion. "Lucas Hart Ranch, about 12 miles north of town. You have a problem with that arrangement. You can come discuss it with me there." "This is kidnapping. This is giving a lady in distress a helping hand." Lucas finally looked at Morse, and his expression was like stone. "Something you clearly weren't planning to do. Now, I've got 4 kids in that wagon who need their supper, and this lady looks like she could use a meal too, so we're going to be on our way." He guided Marion toward the wagon with one hand on her elbow and her carpet bag in his other hand. She moved automatically, her mind still trying to catch up with what was happening. As they reached the wagon, Lucas called to the children. "Evan, make some room in the back. Miss is going to ride with you." The oldest boy immediately shifted aside, creating space near the tailgate. The other children watched with silent curiosity as Lucas helped Marion up. His hands on her waist were impersonal, careful, the touch of someone helping a stranger, nothing more. "You'll be all right back here for a few miles?" he asked. Marion nodded, not trusting her voice. Lucas handed up her carpet bag, then climbed back into the driver's seat. With a flick of the reins, the wagon began to move. As they pulled out of the alley, Marion looked back once. Morse and Tommy Vickers stood in the shadows, watching. The agent's face was twisted with anger, but he made no move to follow. The wagon turned onto the main street, and the 2 men disappeared from view. Marion sat among the children, Lucas's coat still around her shoulders, and felt something inside her chest crack open, not breaking, but releasing. She'd been holding herself so tightly for so long, refusing to cry, refusing to beg, refusing to show just how desperate she'd become. Now, rattling down a dusty street in a stranger's wagon, headed toward an unknown destination, she felt tears slip down her cheeks. The oldest boy, Evan, glanced at her, then quickly away, clearly uncomfortable with her emotion. But the little girl, who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, leaned against Marion's side with the easy trust of childhood. "Don't cry," the girl said softly. "Pa always makes things better." Marion didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply put her arm around the small, warm body beside her and watched as the town of Bridger Falls grew smaller behind them. The sun had nearly set now, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. Ahead, the road stretched out into open country, flanked by rolling hills and distant mountains. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of sage and grass. Marion had no idea where she was going, didn't know who Lucas Hart really was, or why he'd stopped to help her, or what he expected in return. She should probably be frightened, should probably be questioning the wisdom of leaving with a strange man and his children. But she wasn't frightened. For the first time in 3 days, maybe longer, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. And as the wagon carried her away from Bridger Falls and into the gathering dusk, Marion Cross allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over after all. Maybe it was just beginning. The wagon's rhythm was steady and surprisingly soothing, the creak of wood, the soft thud of hooves on packed earth, the occasional jingle of harness. Marion sat in the back, surrounded by children who studied her with varying degrees of interest and wariness. Evan, the oldest, had gone back to staring at the horizon, his jaw set in a way that reminded Marion of Lucas. He had the same strong bone structure, the same serious eyes. Next to him sat 2 younger boys who looked enough alike to be twins, though one was slightly larger. They whispered to each other in voices too low to hear, casting quick glances at Marion every few seconds. And then there was the little girl pressed against her side, the one who'd told her not to cry. Up close, Marion could see that her dress was carefully mended, her hair braided with obvious care, her face scrubbed clean despite the dust of travel. "What's your name?" Marion asked softly. The girl looked up at her with solemn brown eyes. "Rose. I'm 5. Well, almost 6. My birthday's in October." "That's a lovely name." "Mama gave it to me." Rose paused, then added matter-of-factly, "But Mama's dead now." The words were delivered without drama, but they hit Marion like a physical blow. She looked at the other children, really looked at them. and saw the same story written in their two serious faces, their careful silence, the way they sat so close together. These were children who'd known loss. "I'm sorry," Marion said, not just to Rose, but to all of them. The larger of the two middle boys shrugged. "It was 2 years ago. We're all right now." "That's Miles," Rose supplied helpfully. "And that's Caleb. He's my twin, but I'm older by 6 whole minutes." "I'm not your twin," Caleb protested. "Twins look the same. We don't look the same. Do not. Enough." Evan's voice was quiet but firm, and both younger boys fell silent immediately. He glanced at Marion, then away. "They always argue. Don't mind them." "I don't mind." Marion managed a small smile. "I had brothers once. They argued too." "Had?" Rose's voice was very small. "It was a long time ago." Rose seemed to accept this, settling more comfortably against Marion's side. After a moment, she asked, "Are you going to live with us now?" Marion faltered. "I don't know. Your father was kind enough to help me, but I don't want to impose." "Pa wouldn't have brought you if he didn't want you to come," Evan said. He still wasn't looking at her, but his tone was certain. "He doesn't do things by accident." Marion didn't know how to respond to that, so she fell silent, watching the landscape roll past. The land here was different from anything she'd known in Philadelphia. Open. Vast. The sky seemed to go on forever, deepening from purple to black as stars began to emerge. The air smelled clean, sharp, utterly unlike the coal smoke and crowded streets of the city. It should have felt alien. Instead, something in Marion's chest loosened, like a knot she hadn't known she was carrying. They rode for what felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Rose fell asleep against Marion's shoulder. Caleb and Miles eventually stopped whispering and started pointing out constellations to each other. Evan sat silent and watchful, his gaze moving between the road ahead and the woman in the wagon with them. Finally, Lucas pulled the wagon off the main road onto a narrower track. Ahead, Marion could see lights, warm and yellow against the darkness. "Almost home," Lucas called back, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the horses. Home. The word seemed both foreign and achingly familiar. As they drew closer, Marion could make out the shape of a ranch house, solid and low-slung, built to withstand the wind that swept across these open plains. Behind it stood a barn and several outbuildings, all in good repair. Even in the darkness, she could sense the order here, the care taken to maintain things properly. This was a working ranch, and it was worked by someone who took pride in it. Lucas pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and climbed down. He moved to the back and carefully lifted Rose, who mumbled in her sleep but didn't wake. The other children jumped down with the ease of practice. "Evan, get the horses settled," Lucas said quietly. "Miles, Caleb, you help him. I'll start supper." The boys moved off toward the barn without argument. Lucas turned to Marion, Rose still cradled in one arm. "Can you manage?" he asked, gesturing to the wagon. Marion nodded and climbed down less gracefully than the children but without falling. Her legs were stiff from sitting, her whole body trembling with exhaustion that went bone deep. Lucas studied her face for a moment, then jerked his head toward the house. "Come on, you need to eat." The interior of this house was clean and simply furnished, a large main room with a fireplace, a table with 6 chairs, shelves lined with books, and simple crockery. Everything was in its place, but there was a warmth here too, a sense of life being lived. Lucas carried Rose down a short hallway and returned a moment later without her. "She'll sleep through anything once she's out," he said. Then he moved to the kitchen area and began pulling out supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd cooked many meals. Marion stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, still wrapped in Lucas's coat. She should offer to help, should do something, but her body felt disconnected from her will, heavy and slow. "Sit," Lucas said without looking at her. It wasn't harsh, just matter of fact. "You're about to fall over." Marion sat. She watched as he built up the fire in the stove, set water to boil, and began slicing bread and cheese. His movements were economical, practiced. He worked in comfortable silence, and Marion found herself relaxing slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "When did you last eat?" he asked, still focused on his work. 2 days ago, her voice came out rough. "Maybe 3. There was a woman at the boarding house who gave me some broth, but I'm not sure what day that was. Lucas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He just kept working, and a few minutes later he placed a plate in front of her. Bread, cheese, cold chicken, and an apple. Simple food, but more than Marian had seen in days. Eat slowly, he advised. Don't want to make yourself sick. Marian picked up a piece of bread with shaking hands and took a small bite. The taste exploded on her tongue. Butter and salt and everything good. She forced herself to chew slowly, swallow carefully, though every instinct screamed at her to devour everything in front of her. Lucas poured her water from a pitcher, then set about making more food for the boys, who would be coming in soon. He worked quietly, and Marian ate in silence, focusing all her attention on not eating too fast, not taking too much. By the time the boys clattered through the door, Marian had finished about half her plate and felt more human than she had in days. Evan, Miles, and Caleb washed up at a basin near the door, then took their seats at the table. They ate together, the strange assembled family, and nobody asked Marian questions. Nobody demanded explanations. They just passed dishes and made small talk about the horses and tomorrow's chores, and Marian sat among them feeling like a ghost at a feast, present but not quite real. When the meal was finished, the boys cleared the table without being asked. Lucas washed while Evan dried, and the younger boys swept the floor. They moved together like parts of a well-oiled machine, each knowing their role. Miss Cross. Lucas's voice made her look up. He'd hung up the dish towel and was watching her with that same calm, assessing gaze. We've got a spare room. Used to be for storage, but it's got a bed and a window. You're welcome to it for tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest. Marian's throat felt tight. I can't pay you. I don't have anything. Didn't ask you to pay. Lucas's tone was gentle but firm. Asked if you needed a place to sleep. Answer's pretty obvious. But tomorrow, he repeated. For now, just rest. He showed her to a small room off the main hallway. It was simple. A narrow bed with clean sheets, a small dresser, a window with curtains that someone had sewn by hand. There was a rug on the floor and a lamp on the dresser, already lit. Washroom's at the end of the hall, Lucas said. There's water in the pitcher if you need it. Boys and I are early risers, but don't feel like you need to be up at dawn. Sleep as long as you need. Marian clutched her carpet bag to her chest. Mr. Hart, Lucas. She forced herself to meet his eyes. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I could be anyone. I could be... You're someone who needed help, he said simply. That's enough. He left before she could respond, closing the door softly behind him. Marian stood in the middle of the small room and felt the last of her composure crumble. She sank onto the bed, her bag still clutched in her arms, and let herself cry, really cry, for the first time since she'd stepped off that train 3 days ago. She cried for the humiliation of Silas Pemberton's rejection, for the theft of her money and the days of hunger and fear, for the men who'd cornered her in that alley and the way they'd looked at her like she was property to be traded. But she also cried with relief, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was safe, fed, warm. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Didn't know if Lucas would change his mind, or if those men from town would come looking for her, or if this was just a brief respite before everything fell apart again. But tonight, she had a bed. She had food in her stomach. She had a locked door between her and the world. It was enough. It had to be enough. Marian eventually rose and washed her face in the basin, changed into her nightgown, and climbed between the clean sheets. The bed was soft, the pillow smelled like lavender, and through the window she could see stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in 3 days, slept without fear. Morning came with the sound of roosters and the low murmur of voices from the kitchen. Marian woke slowly, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory flooded back. The wagon, the ranch, Lucas Hart's quiet offer of sanctuary. She sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. The room was bright with early sunlight streaming through the curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Outside she could hear the sounds of a working ranch coming to life. Horses nickering, the clang of metal on metal, boots on wooden planks. Marian dressed quickly in her other dress, the one that wasn't quite as worn as what she'd been wearing yesterday. She pinned her hair as neatly as she could manage without a proper mirror, then stood for a moment with her hand on the doorknob, gathering her courage. She had no idea what she was walking into, no idea what Lucas expected from her, or what kind of arrangement this was supposed to be. But staying in the room wouldn't answer those questions. The kitchen was empty when she emerged, though evidence of breakfast lingered. Dishes in the wash basin, the smell of coffee and bacon still hanging in the air. On the table sat a covered plate with a note written in careful, blocky letters. For Miss Cross, help yourself to coffee. Marian lifted the cloth to find eggs, bacon, and toast kept warm. Her eyes stung at the simple kindness of it. She sat and ate slowly, savoring each bite, and had just finished when the back door opened. Lucas stepped inside, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hat in his hands. He stopped when he saw her, nodded once, then moved to pour himself coffee from the pot on the stove. "Sleep all right?" he asked, his back to her. "Yes. Thank you." Marian stood, gathering her plate. "And thank you for breakfast. You didn't have to, had to make it for the boys anyway. No trouble to make extra." He turned, leaning against the counter with his coffee cup cradled in both hands. "We should talk." Marian's stomach clenched despite the food she'd just eaten. "Of course." Lucas gestured to the table, and they both sat. He was quiet for a moment, studying his coffee as if it held answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "I'm not going to ask about your business. What happened before yesterday, that's yours to tell or not tell, as you see fit. But I do need to understand what you're running from, if it's going to show up on my doorstep." "I'm not running from anything illegal," Marian said quickly. "I came here as a mail-order bride. The man who arranged for me, Silas Pemberton, he rejected me the moment I arrived. Then my money was stolen, and I couldn't afford passage back east. That agent, Franklin Morse, he tried to force me into another arrangement with that man, Tommy Vickers." Lucas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Morse has a reputation, not a good one. He's been investigated twice for trafficking women under false pretenses." "I signed a contract," Marian continued. "Morse says I owe the agency $45. I don't have it. I don't have anything." "The contract was with Pemberton, not with Morse's agency. And even if it wasn't, you can't be forced into marriage to settle a debt. That's not how the law works." Lucas took a sip of coffee. "Morse was trying to scare you into accepting Vickers. Once you did, he'd get his money from Vickers and wash his hands of the whole thing. You think he'll come here?" "Maybe. Probably not right away. He'll want to see if you come crawling back on your own first. But if he does come, I'll handle it." Lucas set down his cup and looked at her directly. "Here's what I'm offering. You can stay here, help with the house and the kids, for as long as you need to figure out what you want to do next. You won't owe me money. You won't owe me anything except honest work. When you're ready to leave, I'll make sure you have enough for passage wherever you want to go." Marian stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Lucas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost distant. "My wife, Sarah, she died 2 years ago. Fever. It came on fast and took her before we could even get the doctor out here. Since then, it's been me and the kids trying to manage. Evan does his best to help, but he's 13. He shouldn't have to be raising his brothers and sister." He paused, turning the coffee cup in his hands. "I've been thinking about hiring someone to help with the house, but I haven't found anyone I trust. Most women in town either want to get married or they're already married. The ones who aren't, well, they're not the kind I'd want around my children. You're in need of a place. I'm in need of help. Seems like we could help each other." "You're trusting me with your children based on 5 minutes in an alley. I'm trusting my gut, and my gut says you're someone who's had a run of bad luck but isn't looking for handouts. You were sitting behind that inn half-starved, but you weren't begging. You weren't crying. You were just enduring. That tells me something about your character." Marian's throat felt tight. "What if I'm not good with children?" A hint of a smile touched Lucas's mouth. "Rose fell asleep on you in about 10 minutes. That's a record. Girl usually won't settle for anyone but me." Before Marian could respond, the back door burst open and Caleb tumbled in, followed closely by Miles. Both boys were flushed and breathing hard. "Pa, the fence in the south pasture is down again," Miles announced. "Same spot as last week." Lucas sighed and stood. That old post finally give up? Snapped clean through. Horses are still in the pasture, but they could wander if we don't fix it soon. All right. Get Evan and the tools. We'll head out after I finish my coffee. Lucas glanced at Marion. You settle in today? Look around? Get your bearings? We can talk more tonight. He drained his cup and headed out with the boys, leaving Marion alone in the kitchen. She sat for a moment, processing everything. Then she stood and began washing the breakfast dishes. It was something to do, something useful, and her hands needed the familiar motion. She'd just finished when Rose appeared in the doorway, her hair sleep-mussed and her nightgown wrinkled. The little girl rubbed her eyes and patted across the floor in bare feet. Good morning, Marion said gently. Rose studied her with solemn eyes. You're still here. I am. Your father said I could stay for a while. Are you going to be our new mama? The question was so direct, so innocent, that Marion had to take a breath before answering. No, sweetheart, I'm just going to help around the house. Rose seemed to consider this. That's okay. Evan says we don't need a new mama anyway. He says we're doing fine on our own. I think you're doing very well, Marion agreed. Now, should we get you dressed and fed? Rose nodded and took Marion's hand with easy trust, leading her back down the hallway to a room she shared with her brothers. The space was neat despite being occupied by 4 children. Beds made, clothes folded, toys put away. Marion helped Rose into a simple dress and braided her hair, fingers moving with practiced ease. By the time they returned to the kitchen, Rose chattering about her favorite doll and the kittens in the barn, Marion felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Useful. The day passed in a blur of small tasks. Marion cleaned the kitchen properly, organized the pantry, and started bread dough rising. Rose followed her like a shadow, helping where she could, and narrating a running stream of thoughts about everything from the weather to whether rabbits could talk to each other. Around midday, the males returned for lunch, dusty, sweaty, and ravenous. Marion served the bread and cheese she'd found in the cold box, along with leftover chicken from last night. The boys ate like they hadn't seen food in weeks, barely pausing to breathe between bites. Evan watched Marion when he thought she wasn't looking. His expression wasn't hostile exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. Wary, reserved, like he was waiting for her to prove herself one way or another. After lunch, Lucas and the boys headed back out to finish the fence. Rose announced she was going to play with the kittens and invited Marion to join her. The barn was dim and cool, smelling of hay and horses and the particular sweetness of well-kept livestock. Rose led Marion to a corner where a calico cat had made a nest, and 5 tiny kittens tumbled over each other in a squeaking pile. That one's Patches, Rose said, pointing to a black and white kitten. And that's Socks, and that's Bandit, and those 2 are just baby because I can't tell them apart yet. Marion smiled and sat down in the hay, letting Rose place kittens in her lap. They were so small, so perfect, their eyes barely open, and their mews like tiny bells. Do you like them? Rose asked anxiously. I love them. Rose beamed. Mama loved cats, too. She said they were good company when you were lonely. The little girl's voice dropped. Do you get lonely? Marion looked down at the kittens, their small bodies warm against her hands. Sometimes, yes. Me too. Rose leaned against Marion's shoulder. But it's better when Pa's here. And Evan and Miles and Caleb, even though they're annoying. They sat together in comfortable silence, and Marion felt something shift in her chest. This child, who'd lost her mother so young, was offering comfort in the only way she knew how. And somehow, it was exactly what Marion needed. That evening, after another simple meal, Lucas asked Marion to walk with him while the boys did the dishes. They strolled toward the pasture where horses grazed in the fading light, the air cooling and pleasant. You've been busy today, Lucas observed. I wanted to be useful. You are. Rose hasn't stopped talking about you all afternoon. According to her, you're the best person she's ever met, aside from me and her mama. Marion felt her cheeks warm. She's a sweet child. She is, but she's also lonely in a way the boys aren't. They have each other, always have. Rose was so young when Sarah died that she barely remembers having a mother. She's been the only girl in a house full of men and boys, and I know she feels it even if she doesn't say so. They reached the fence and leaned against it, watching the horses. One of them, a gray mare, ambled over and nudged Lucas's shoulder, looking for treats. He scratched her nose absently. "I meant what I said this morning," Lucas continued. "You can stay as long as you need to, but I want to make sure you understand what that means. This isn't charity. I need help, real help, and I'm offering you a job, not a handout. You'll work, and in exchange you'll have room and board and a small wage when I can manage it." "What about those men, Morse and Vickers?" "Let me worry about them." Lucas's jaw tightened. "Men like that are bullies. They prey on people who can't fight back. But they're also cowards. Once they realize you're not alone and defenseless, they'll move on to easier targets. You're very confident. I'm a realist, and I know this territory. Morse won't want trouble with me. I'm on the town council, and I've got friends who don't take kindly to men who mistreat women. He'll bluster and threaten, but in the end, he'll back down." Marian wanted to believe him, but she'd learned the hard way that promises didn't always hold. "What if he doesn't?" she asked quietly. Lucas turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Then I'll make it very clear that you're under my protection and that any attempt to force you into anything will be met with consequences. I'm not a violent man, Miss Cross, but I will defend what's mine. And while you're on this ranch, you're mine to defend." The words should have felt possessive, threatening. Instead, they felt like a shield. "Thank you," Marian whispered. They stood in companionable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. In the distance, Marian could hear the boys' voices raised in some kind of argument, followed by Evan's quieter intervention. Normal sounds, family sounds. "Tell me about your wife," Marian said suddenly. "If you don't mind." Lucas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Sarah was a force of nature. Small woman, but fierce. She could outwork most men, outthink all of them, and she never backed down from a challenge. When we met, I was a drifter with big ideas and no money. She saw something in me anyway, believed I could build something here." His voice grew softer. "She was right. We built this ranch from nothing, just the two of us and Evan, who was barely walking. Then came the other boys and Rose. Sarah loved being a mother, loved this life. When the fever took her," he stopped, swallowed hard. "It broke something in all of us, but especially in the kids. They lost their whole world in a single night. I'm sorry. Life doesn't ask permission before it takes things from you. You learn that quick out here." Lucas pushed away from the fence. "But it also gives you things you don't expect, like someone who knows how to make bread showing up just when you're tired of serving the kids hard biscuits every meal." Marian laughed despite herself. "Your biscuits were that bad?" Evan compared them to rocks. I think he was being generous. They walked back toward the house, and Marian felt something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. Not quite happiness, it was too soon for that, but maybe the beginning of peace. 3 days passed in a rhythm that became almost comfortable. Marian woke early, helped prepare breakfast, and spent her days managing the household while Lucas and the boys worked the ranch. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, and slowly began to understand the patterns of this family. Evan remained reserved but had stopped watching her with quite so much suspicion. Miles and Caleb had decided she was acceptable, especially after she'd helped them build a trap for catching lizards, a project that had resulted in chaos, laughter, and exactly 0 captured lizards. Rose had become her constant companion, following Marian through her tasks and chattering endlessly about everything and nothing, and Lucas was steady, quiet. He treated Marian with careful respect, never presuming, never crossing the unspoken boundaries between employer and employee. But sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Marian was hanging laundry in the yard, Rose playing nearby with her doll, when she heard the sound of horses approaching. She turned to see 2 riders coming up the drive, and her stomach dropped when she recognized them. Franklin Morse sat astride a bay gelding, his face set in grim determination. Beside him rode Tommy Vickers, looking more sober than he had in the alley, but no less dangerous. Marian's hands froze on the wet sheet she'd been pinning. Rose looked up, sensing her tension. "Who's that?" the little girl asked. "Go inside," Marian said quietly. "Find your father." "But now, Rose, please." Something in Marion's voice made Rose obey without further argument. She gathered her doll and ran for the barn where Lucas was working. Marion stood her ground as the two men dismounted. Morse's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Miss Cross, I thought I might find you here." "Mr. Morse," Marion kept her voice level. "What do you want?" "What I want is for you to honor your contract. You signed an agreement that Mr. Pemberton voided when he rejected me. The agreement was with the agency, not with Pemberton specifically, and Tommy here is willing to honor it in Pemberton's place." Morse pulled a folded document from his jacket. "Everything legal and proper. All you have to do is come back to town and sign the new papers." "I'm not interested." Tommy Vickers stepped forward, his face flushed. "Now see here, you don't have a choice in this. You owe money, and I'm offering to pay it. That makes you mine." "I'm not yours. I'm not anyone's." Marion's voice shook slightly, but she didn't back down. "I told you in town, and I'm telling you now, I'm not marrying you." "You think you can just hide out here on Hart's ranch?" Morse's voice turned sharp. "Playing house with his kids? Lucas Hart is a good man, but he's not going to protect you forever. Sooner or later, you'll have to face reality. The reality is that she's employed here, doing honest work for honest pay." Lucas's voice came from behind Marion, calm but carrying steel underneath. "And she doesn't owe you a damn thing." Marion turned to see Lucas walking toward them, Evan close behind. The boy's hands were clenched into fists, his young face hard with anger. Morse's expression soured. "Hart, I should have known you'd stick your nose into this. It's my ranch, my employee. That makes it my business." Lucas stopped beside Marion, his presence solid and reassuring. "Now you've said your piece, time for you to leave." "We're not leaving without her," Tommy said stubbornly. She doesn't owe you anything," Lucas interrupted. "Your so-called contract isn't worth the paper it's written on. You want to take this to a judge, go ahead, but I'm guessing you won't because you know exactly how that would turn out." Morse's face reddened. "You can't just keep her here against the law." "I'm not keeping her anywhere. She's free to leave any time she chooses. But she's choosing to stay. You got a problem with that? Take it up with Sheriff Dawson. I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear about how you're trying to force women into marriage to settle debts." The mention of the sheriff made Morse's expression falter. Lucas noticed and pressed his advantage. "In fact, why don't we all ride into town right now and discuss this with him? I'm sure he'd love to hear about your business practices, Morse. All those women you've placed who mysteriously end up with men they never agreed to marry. The ones who try to leave and find themselves facing threats and coercion." "That's slander. It's truth, and you know it." Lucas's voice was cold now. "You've been playing this game for years, and you've gotten away with it because most of your victims are too scared or too desperate to fight back. But Miss Cross isn't alone anymore. She's got people who'll stand with her." "She's got us," Evan said suddenly, his young voice clear and strong. "And if you try to take her, you'll have to go through all of us." Morse looked between Lucas and Evan, calculation in his eyes. Marion could almost see him weighing his options, considering whether this fight was worth it. Finally, he spat into the dust. "Fine, keep her. But don't come crying to me when she proves to be more trouble than she's worth." "I won't," Lucas said evenly. Tommy Vickers looked like he wanted to argue, but Morse grabbed his arm. "Come on, we're wasting our time here." They mounted their horses and rode off at a canter, dust rising in their wake. Marion watched them go, her whole body trembling with adrenaline and relief. When they were out of sight, she turned to Lucas. "Thank you." "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right." Lucas's expression softened. "You all right?" "I am now." Marion looked at Evan, who still stood rigid with tension. "Thank you, too, for standing up for me." Evan shrugged, but she could see color rising in his cheeks. "Pa was right. You're part of this ranch now. That means we look out for you." Something in Marion's chest cracked open at those words. Part of this ranch. Part of something. It had been so long since she'd belonged anywhere that she'd forgotten what it felt like. "I should finish the laundry," she said, her voice unsteady. Lucas nodded. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." He walked away with Evan, their voices low as they talked. Marion turned back to her task, but her hands were shaking too badly to pin the sheets. Rose emerged from the house, running to Marion and wrapping her small arms around Marion's waist. "I was scared. the little girl admitted. Me too, Marion whispered, kneeling to hold her properly. But it's all right now. Your father made it all right. That evening, after the children were in bed, Lucas found Marion on the porch. She was sitting in one of the old rocking chairs, staring out at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear Wyoming sky. Mind if I join you? He asked. It's your porch. It's your porch too, for as long as you want it to be. He sat in the other rocker, and they were quiet for a while, the only sound the creak of wood and the distant call of night birds. Do you think they'll come back? Marion finally asked. No, Morse knows I meant what I said about the sheriff. He'll cut his losses and move on. Lucas paused. But even if he does come back, the answer will be the same. You're under my protection now, and that's not going to change. Why? The question burst out of her. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I could be everything Morse said. Trouble, a burden. You're not. Lucas's voice was firm. You're a woman who got dealt a bad hand and refused to give up. You could have begged or stolen or accepted Vickers' offer just to survive. But you didn't. You sat behind that inn and waited, and I'll bet you would have died before you compromised yourself. He turned to look at her, his expression serious in the moonlight. That kind of strength is rare, and it's exactly the kind of person I want around my children. Marion's throat felt too tight to speak. Besides, Lucas added, his tone lighter, Rose has decided you're staying, and when Rose decides something, that's pretty much the end of the discussion. Marion laughed, the sound shaky but genuine. She's quite determined. Gets it from her mother. They sat together in comfortable silence, and Marion felt something she'd thought lost forever beginning to take root in her chest. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of someone with no other options, but real hope. The kind that came from being chosen, being valued, being protected. Lucas Hart had stepped into that alley and changed everything. Not because he wanted something from her, but simply because it was the right thing to do. And Marion was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found a place where she could stop running and start living. The stars wheeled overhead, and the Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Marion Cross felt like she might actually have a future worth fighting for. The weeks that followed Morse's departure settled into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be real. Marion woke each morning half expecting to find it had all been a dream, that she'd open her eyes to the cold reality of that alley behind the Silver Spur Inn. But every morning brought the same small room, the same sounds of a household waking, the same sense of belonging that both comforted and terrified her. She'd learned the patterns of the ranch like a language. Lucas rose before dawn, starting coffee before heading out to check the stock. Evan followed 15 minutes later, moving with the quiet responsibility of someone who'd grown up too fast. Miles and Caleb needed coaxing from their beds, stumbling to the breakfast table still half asleep. Rose was unpredictable, some mornings bouncing with energy, others clinging to Marion's skirts and needing gentle encouragement to face the day. Marion had found her place in these patterns. She had the coffee ready when Lucas came in from his first rounds. She packed lunches for the boys to take into the fields. She braided Rose's hair and listened to her endless stories. She mended torn shirts and patched worn trousers and kept the house running with quiet efficiency. It was honest work, and it fed something in her she hadn't known was starving. One morning in early October, Marion was kneading bread dough when Evan appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there awkwardly, shifting his weight from foot to foot in a way that reminded her he was still just a boy despite the man's work he did. "Need something?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. "Ma used to make apple pie this time of year," he said abruptly. "There's wild apples down by the creek. I was thinking, if you wanted, we could pick some." It was the first time Evan had voluntarily sought her out for anything beyond basic household matters. Marion felt the significance of the moment like a weight in her chest. "I'd like that," she said simply. They went that afternoon, taking Rose and the twins with them. The walk to the creek was beautiful, the autumn air crisp and the cottonwood trees already turning gold. Rose skipped ahead, singing some nonsensical song, while Miles and Caleb raced each other over every fallen log and boulder. Evan walked beside Marion, quiet but not uncomfortable. When they reached the apple trees, gnarled and wild and heavy with small tart fruit, he showed her which ones Sarah had preferred. She said the little ones made the best pies, he explained, reaching up to pluck a reddish apple from a high branch. Bigger ones are too sweet, too soft. These have more flavor. Marian took the apple he handed her, turning it over in her palm. Your mother sounds like she was a wonderful cook. She was good at everything. Evan's voice was matter-of-fact, but Marian heard the grief underneath. Pa says I'm like her that way. Good with my hands, good at figuring things out. I can see that. You work harder than most grown men I've known. Evan's ears went pink, but he looked pleased. They picked in companionable silence for a while, filling the baskets they'd brought. Rose tried to help, but kept eating more apples than she collected. The twins had abandoned picking entirely in favor of building a dam in the creek. Can I ask you something? Evan said suddenly. Of course. Are you going to stay? Marian's hand stilled on the apple she'd been reaching for. Your father said I could stay as long as I needed to. That's not what I asked. Evan looked at her directly, his young face serious. People say things like that, but then they leave anyway. Ma used to have friends who'd promised to visit, to write, to stay in touch. But after she died, they all just disappeared. Like we didn't matter anymore. The pain in his voice made Marian's throat tight. She climbed down from the low branch she'd been standing on and faced him properly. I can't promise I'll be here forever, she said honestly. Life doesn't let us make promises like that. But I can promise that I'm not looking to leave. I can promise that being here, with all of you, is the first time I've felt like I belong somewhere in more years than I can count. And I can promise that if circumstances ever do require me to go, it won't be because I wanted to. Does that help? Evan studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, that helps. They finished picking as the sun began its descent, then walked back to the ranch with baskets full of apples and Rose asleep on Evan's shoulders. Lucas met them at the house, taking in the scene with a small smile. Apple pie tonight? He asked. If I can remember how to make decent crust, Marian replied. Ma's recipe is in the book on the shelf, Evan offered, the one with the blue cover. That evening, Marian made 3 pies using Sarah's recipe, written in elegant script on yellowed paper tucked between the pages of a worn cookbook. The whole house filled with the scent of cinnamon and butter and apples, and when they sat down to eat after supper, even Miles and Caleb were quiet with appreciation. Lucas took a bite and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were bright with something that might have been tears. Just like Sarah's, he said quietly. Thank you. Marian felt she should say something, but the moment felt too fragile for words. Rose solved the problem by asking for a second slice, and the spell broke into normal family chaos. Later, after the children were in bed, Marian found Lucas on the porch again. It had become a habit, these quiet conversations under the stars. Sometimes they talked about the ranch, or the children, or nothing in particular. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence. Tonight, Lucas spoke first. Evan told me what you said about staying. I hope that was all right. I didn't want to presume. It was more than all right. It was honest, and that boy needs honesty. He's been disappointed too many times by people making promises they couldn't keep. Lucas leaned against the porch railing, his face half-shadowed. His grandparents on Sarah's side, they swore they'd stay involved after she died. Lasted about 6 months before the visit stopped. Said it was too painful, seeing the kids without their daughter. Like we weren't all in pain. People handle grief poorly, Marian said softly. They do. But those kids, they remember. They remember who stayed and who left. And they're watching you, Marian, waiting to see which one you'll be. The use of her first name startled her. He'd been calling her Miss Cross since she'd arrived, maintaining a careful formality. The shift felt significant. I meant what I told Evan, she said. I'm not planning to leave. Even if Morse comes back? Even if Pemberton changes his mind? Even if something better comes along? Even then. Marian turned to face him fully. Lucas, I had a life in Philadelphia. I had work and a room and nothing else. No family, no friends, no one who'd miss me if I disappeared tomorrow. I was so lonely I answered an advertisement from a complete stranger just for the chance to matter to someone. And when that fell apart, when I was sitting in that alley waiting to die, or worse, I thought that was all I deserved. That I'd used up my chances at anything better. She paused, her voice growing stronger. But then you stopped. You saw me when no one else did, and you offered me something I'd given up hoping for, a place, a purpose, people who might actually need me around. So no, I'm not looking for something better because I don't think there is anything better than this. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You matter here. To the kids. To—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "You matter. I want you to know that." Before Marion could respond, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the peaceful night. Both of them turned toward the road, tension immediate and instinctive. A single rider was approaching fast, the horse's gait urgent. As they drew closer, Lucas relaxed slightly. "That's James Thornton from the neighboring ranch. Something must be wrong." The rider pulled up in a cloud of dust, and James Thornton swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped. He was a weathered man in his 50s, his face grim in the lamplight spilling from the house. "Lucas, sorry to come so late, but I thought you should know. Franklin Morse was at the saloon tonight, drinking heavy and talking big. Says he's filing a complaint with the territorial judge about you harboring a woman with outstanding debts. Claims you're interfering with legitimate business contracts." Lucas's jaw tightened. "He's bluffing. There's no legitimate contract." "Maybe so, but he's got Tommy Vickers backing his story, and he's convinced a few other men to sign statements saying they witnessed the original agreement. Judge Morrison is sympathetic to business interests, even questionable ones. If Morse presents it right, Morrison might side with him just to avoid setting a precedent about debt enforcement." Marion felt ice in her stomach. "What does that mean?" Thornton glanced at her, sympathy in his eyes. "Means there could be a hearing. If the judge rules in Morse's favor, you could be legally obligated to either pay the debt or honor the contract. And if you can't pay—" "She's not honoring any contract with Tommy Vickers," Lucas said flatly. "I'll pay the debt myself if it comes to that." "Lucas, no," Marion started, but he cut her off with a look. "Not up for discussion, but it won't come to that. I know Judge Morrison. He's got his quirks, but he's not corrupt. Once he hears the full story, he'll throw Morse's complaint out." "When's the hearing?" Lucas asked Thornton. 3 days. Monday morning at the courthouse. Morse made sure half the town heard about it. He's trying to make an example of you, Lucas. Show that even a man of your standing can't just ignore legal obligations." After Thornton left, Lucas and Marion sat back down on the porch. The peaceful mood from earlier was shattered, replaced by tension and worry. "I'm sorry," Marion said quietly. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your doorstep. You've brought capable hands, good cooking, and the first genuine laughter I've heard from Rose in 2 years. That's not trouble." Lucas's voice was firm. "Morse is the problem, not you. And Monday we're going to make sure everyone knows it." The next 3 days passed in a strange kind of limbo. The household routines continued, but underneath everything was a current of anxiety. Evan became more protective, following Marion around like a silent guardian. Rose grew clingy, sensing the tension even if she didn't understand its source. Miles and Caleb were quieter than usual, their typical rowdiness subdued. Lucas spent hours going through paperwork, writing letters, and riding into town to speak with people Marion never met. He wouldn't tell her the details, just said he was building their case. Sunday evening, the night before the hearing, Lucas called a family meeting around the dinner table. All 4 children sat with unusual stillness, their faces serious. "Tomorrow, Miss Marion and I have to go to town for a hearing," Lucas explained, his tone calm but honest. "Mr. Morse is claiming she owes money and trying to force her into a contract. We're going to explain to the judge why that's not true and not legal. Evan, you'll be in charge while we're gone. Mrs. Thornton has agreed to check in around midday." "What if the judge says she has to leave?" Rose's voice was very small. "He won't," Lucas said with more confidence than Marion felt. "But if something unexpected happens, I want you all to remember that we're a family. We stick together and we take care of our own. Miss Marion is our own now, understood?" 4 heads nodded solemnly. That night, Marion couldn't sleep. She lay in her small room, staring at the ceiling and trying not to imagine all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. Around midnight, she gave up and went to the kitchen for water. Lucas was already there, sitting at the table with papers spread in front of him. He looked up when she entered, unsurprised. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "Too many thoughts." Marian poured herself water and sat across from him. Lucas, if the judge rules against us, I want you to let me pay the debt however I have to. I won't let you sacrifice for me. And I won't let Morse bully you into a marriage you don't want. We're past that kind of barbarism, even out here. Lucas gathered his papers into a neat stack. I've been thinking about this all wrong. Morse wants to make this about contracts and debts and legal obligations. But that's not what this is really about. Then what is it about? Control. Power. He makes his living convincing desperate women they have no choices, then profiting when they accept whatever he offers. You're dangerous to him because you said no. You found another option, a better option, and that threatens his entire business model. If you can escape, other women might try too. Marian hadn't thought about it that way. So what do? We make sure the judge understands that. We show him you're not some runaway bride shirking obligations. You're a woman who was defrauded, abandoned, and then targeted by a predator. We show him that Morse's business is exploitation dressed up in legal language. And we make him see that ruling in Morse's favor sets a precedent that could hurt a lot of women who come after you. Lucas's eyes met hers across the table. You're not just fighting for yourself tomorrow, Marian. You're fighting for every woman who might find herself in a similar situation. That's why we can't lose. The weight of it settled on Marian's shoulders, but instead of crushing her, it felt like armor. Lucas was right. This was bigger than just her. Then we won't lose, she said quietly. Monday morning dawned clear and cold. Marian dressed in her best dress, the one she'd worn when she first arrived, carefully cleaned and pressed. She braided her hair simply and looked at herself in the small mirror, trying to see what the judge would see. A woman. Just a woman. Neither a commodity nor a burden, just someone trying to live with dignity. The ride to town was quiet. Lucas drove the wagon with Marian beside him, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The children had hugged her goodbye with fierce intensity, and Marian had promised to come back. She intended to keep that promise. The courthouse was a simple building on the main street, already crowded with people when they arrived. Marian felt their stares, heard the whispers. Morse had done his work well. Half the town had turned out to watch the spectacle. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Marian expected. Judge Morrison sat behind a raised desk, a stern-looking man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes. Morse and Tommy Vickers sat at one table with a lawyer Marian didn't recognize. Lucas led her to the other table, where they sat alone. "Lucas, where's our lawyer?" Marian whispered. "We don't need one. Truth stands on its own." Before Marian could respond, the judge called the hearing to order. His voice was gravelly but clear as he outlined the complaint Morse had filed. "Mr. Morse claims that Miss Marian Cross entered into a binding contract with his agency to marry upon arrival in Wyoming, that said marriage was arranged and paid for, and that Miss Cross is now in breach of that contract. He further claims that Mr. Hart is harboring her in violation of legitimate business agreements. Mr. Morse, present your case." Morse's lawyer stood and painted a picture of Marian as a dishonest woman who'd taken advantage of his client's services and then reneged on her obligations. He presented the original contract, travel receipts, and statements from several men who claimed to have witnessed the arrangement. "The agency fulfilled its obligations," the lawyer concluded. "They brought Miss Cross to Wyoming as agreed. The fact that the original placement didn't work out is unfortunate, but it doesn't void Miss Cross's obligation to enter into a marriage or repay the agency's costs. Mr. Vickers has generously offered to honor the contract in place of the original client, providing Miss Cross with exactly what she came here seeking, a husband and a home. Her refusal to accept this reasonable solution is a clear breach of contract." Judge Morrison listened without expression, making occasional notes. When Morse's lawyer sat down, the judge looked at Lucas. "Mr. Hart, I understand you're representing yourself and Miss Cross." Lucas stood. "I am, Your Honor, and with respect to opposing counsel, nearly everything he just said is either misleading or outright false." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Lucas waited for it to subside, then continued. "First, the contract Miss Cross signed was with a specific individual, Silas Pemberton. When Mr. Pemberton rejected her upon arrival, that contract was voided by his own actions, not hers. Second, the agency did not fulfill its obligations. They promised Miss Cross a legitimate marriage arrangement and instead delivered her to a man who took one look at her and walked away. Third, Miss Cross's money was stolen while she was in transit, leaving her unable to pay for return passage even if she'd wanted to. Lucas pulled papers from his jacket. I have here a statement from the sheriff confirming that multiple complaints have been filed about theft targeting new arrivals at the train station. I also have testimony from 3 women who used Morse's agency and found themselves in situations nothing like what they were promised, including one who was placed with a man currently serving time for assault. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose. He gestured for Lucas to bring the papers forward, and he studied them carefully. Furthermore, Lucas continued, Mr. Vickers is not generously offering to honor anything. He's offering to purchase Miss Cross like livestock. The contract she signed was for a specific arrangement with a specific individual based on specific representations about that individual's character and circumstances. Substituting a drunk stable worker with a violent temper is not the same arrangement. Tommy Vickers surged to his feet. I never laid a hand on her. No, Lucas agreed coldly. Because I stopped you. But the sheriff's records show 2 complaints against you for assault in the past 18 months, one resulting in conviction and a fine. That's public record, Your Honor. The judge made more notes, his expression growing increasingly stern. Morse's lawyer tried to object, but Judge Morrison waved him to silence. Is there more, Mr. Hart? Yes, Your Honor. I want to address the real issue here, which isn't contracts or debts, but control. Mr. Morse runs a business that exploits desperate women. He promises them new lives and then deliberately puts them in vulnerable positions where they have no choice but to accept whatever arrangement he offers, no matter how unsuitable or dangerous. Miss Cross is here today because she refused to be exploited, because she had the courage to say no even when she had nothing. Lucas turned to look at Marion, and his voice softened. She sat in an alley for 3 days without money or food rather than accept an arrangement she knew was wrong. That's not breach of contract, Your Honor. That's strength of character. And if this court rules that she should be punished for that strength, it's sending a message to every woman in this territory that they're nothing more than property to be traded when contracts demand it. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Judge Morrison sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Mr. Morse, I have some questions for you. What followed was an interrogation that grew increasingly uncomfortable for Morse. The judge wanted specifics about the agency's vetting process, about how placements were made, about what happened to women who tried to leave arrangements they found unsuitable. With each question, Morse's answers grew more evasive and his lawyer more agitated. Finally, Judge Morrison held up his hand for silence. I've heard enough. Here's my ruling. He looked directly at Morse. The contract Miss Cross signed was specific to Mr. Pemberton. When he voided that arrangement, the contract became null. Miss Cross has no legal obligation to marry Mr. Vickers or any other substitute. As for the debt, I find that the agency failed to fulfill its basic obligations of due diligence and client protection. The theft of Miss Cross's money while under the agency's care further demonstrates this failure. Therefore, I'm ruling that no debt is owed. Morse's face went purple. Your Honor, I'm not finished. The judge's voice cracked like a whip. Furthermore, I'm ordering an investigation into your agency's practices. If even half of what Mr. Hart presented is accurate, you've been defrauding women for years. This court will not be party to that fraud. Case dismissed. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the stunned courtroom. Marion felt her knees go weak with relief. Beside her, Lucas let out a breath he'd been holding and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Morse was on his feet, sputtering protests, but Judge Morrison ignored him. Tommy Vickers stormed out, slamming the courtroom door behind him. People in the gallery began whispering, the sound building like a wave. Miss Cross. The judge's voice cut through the noise, and Marion looked up to find him studying her. You showed considerable courage in standing your ground. I hope you found a better situation than what brought you to Wyoming. I have, Your Honor, Marion said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Thank you. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun felt almost too bright. Marion stood on the steps, blinking and trying to process what had just happened. She was free, truly free. No debt, no obligation, no threat hanging over her. Lucas appeared beside her, and without thinking, Marion turned and hugged him. He went still for a moment, surprised. then carefully put his arms around her and held on. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for fighting for me." "Always," he said quietly, "for as long as you need me to." They stood there for a long moment while people streamed past them, some offering congratulations, others just staring. Marian didn't care. For the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she felt like she could breathe. The ride back to the ranch was lighter, the tension that had gripped them both finally releasing. They talked about small things, what to make for dinner, whether the fence in the north pasture needed replacing, how Evan was doing with his reading lessons. Normal things, family things. When they pulled up to the house, all 4 children came running out. Rose launched herself at Marian before the wagon had fully stopped, and Marian caught her, swinging her around while the little girl shrieked with delight. "You came back!" Rose cried. "I knew you would. But Caleb said maybe you wouldn't, but I knew." "Of course I came back," Marian said, setting her down but keeping hold of her hand. "I promised, didn't I?" Evan stood a little apart, trying to look casual, but Marian could see the relief in his eyes. She met his gaze and smiled, and after a moment he smiled back. That evening they celebrated with a special dinner, fried chicken and mashed potatoes and the last of the apple pie. The children were animated, talking over each other, and Lucas watched them all with an expression of quiet contentment. Later, after the chaos of bedtime had settled and the house was quiet, Marian found herself on the porch again with Lucas. The stars were brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang to the moon. "It really is over," Marian said wonderingly. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find out it was all a dream." "It's real. You're free, and you're safe, and nobody can take that from you." Lucas paused. "The question now is, what do you want to do with that freedom?" Marian knew what he was asking. Now that she had the choice, truly had it, would she stay? She looked out at the land stretching dark and vast under the stars, at the house behind her full of sleeping children, at the man beside her who'd fought for her when he had no reason to beyond simple decency. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "If you'll have me. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there's nowhere else I want to be. This ranch, these children, this life. It's become mine somehow, and I'd like to keep it, if that's all right." Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "More than all right. It's what I was hoping you'd say." They sat together in companionable silence, and Marian felt something shift and settle in her chest. The past was truly behind her now. Morse, Pemberton, the agency, all of it was finished. What lay ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Marian found she wasn't afraid of that uncertainty. She was ready for whatever came next. The days after the hearing settled into something deeper than routine. Marian had been working at the ranch for weeks now, but there was a difference in how she moved through the house, how she spoke to the children, how she met Lucas's eyes across the dinner table. The fear that had followed her like a shadow was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that felt almost like peace. But peace, she was learning, didn't mean easy. October gave way to November, and with it came the first real cold. Frost painted the windows in delicate patterns each morning, and the children's breath puffed white when they did their chores. The work of preparing for winter intensified. Wood to be split and stacked, root vegetables to be stored, the last of the garden to be harvested before the killing frost took it all. Marian threw herself into the work with a determination that sometimes surprised even her. She learned to render fat for soap, to salt meat for preservation, to check the root cellar for signs of rot or pest damage. Her hands, once soft from seamstress work, grew calloused and strong. Her back ached at the end of each day, but it was an honest ache, the kind that came from work that mattered. The children tested her in small ways, as children do. Miles and Caleb brought a snake into the house, hiding it in a basket near where Marian was working. When she discovered it, she'd calmly carried the basket outside, released the snake, and informed the boys they'd be doing their own laundry for a week. They'd grumbled but accepted the consequence without argument, and the next day Miles had shyly asked her to teach him how to darn his own socks. Rose tested her differently, with questions that came at bedtime when the little girl was supposed to be sleeping. "If you got married, would you leave us? And do you think about your real family? And once, heartbreakingly, do you wish you had different children instead of us?" Marian had pulled Rose into her lap for that question, holding her close. "Sweetheart, I don't have any other children. I just have you and your brothers, and I wouldn't trade any of you for anything in the world. Not even for real ones. You are real, Marian had said firmly. You're as real as it gets. But it was Evan who tested her most, with his silences and his watchful eyes, and the way he sometimes looked at her like he was waiting for her to prove him wrong about something. He worked from dawn to dark alongside his father, shouldering responsibilities no 13-year-old should have to carry, and he rarely asked for anything, which was why Marian noticed when he started struggling with his reading lessons. She'd found him one evening in the barn, sitting in the loft with a book open on his lap and frustration written across his young face. He didn't hear her approach, and when she climbed the ladder, he startled and tried to hide the book. "I'm just taking a break," he said defensively. "May I?" Marian gestured to the space beside him. He shrugged, which she took as permission. She settled onto the hay and glanced at the book, a worn copy of adventure stories, the kind boys his age typically devoured. "Having trouble with that one?" she asked gently. "No." Then after a pause, "Maybe. Some of the words are strange. Can I help?" Evan's jaw tightened. "Pa says reading is important, says I need to keep up with it, even with all the ranch work, but he doesn't have time to help, and I don't want to bother him with it when he's already doing so much." "What if you bothered me instead?" Evan looked at her suspiciously. "You'd do that." "I was a seamstress, but before that I helped in a school for a few years. I'm good with reading, and I'd like to help if you'll let me." He studied her face for a long moment, then slowly handed her the book. They sat together in the warm dimness of the barn while Marian helped him work through the difficult passages, explaining words and context without making him feel foolish for not knowing. By the time they climbed down from the loft, something had shifted between them. The next evening, Evan appeared at the kitchen table after supper with his book. "If you're not too busy," he said quietly. Marian smiled. "I'm never too busy for this." It became a nightly ritual. After the dishes were done and the younger children were getting ready for bed, Evan would bring his book and Marian would sit with him, helping him improve not just his reading, but his understanding of what he read. Sometimes Miles and Caleb would join them, drawn by the sound of Marian's voice as she read aloud from the more exciting passages. Even Rose would creep close, her doll tucked under her arm, listening with wide eyes to stories of adventure in distant lands. Lucas would watch from his chair by the fire, mending tack or going over accounts, and sometimes Marian would catch him smiling at the scene they made. His children gathered around this woman who'd arrived with nothing and somehow become essential to their lives. One particularly cold evening in mid-November, a neighbor stopped by with news that sent ripples through the small community. The Hargrove family, who ranched about 15 miles west, had lost their barn to a fire. No one was hurt, but they'd lost most of their winter feed and several head of cattle. The neighbor was organizing a work party to help rebuild before the snow came. "I'll be there," Lucas said immediately. "Evan, you'll come with me. We'll leave before dawn tomorrow." After the neighbor left, Lucas turned to Marian. "It'll be 3, maybe 4 days of work. Can you manage here with just the little ones?" "Of course," Marian said, though the thought of Lucas and Evan being gone sent an unexpected flutter of anxiety through her chest. "We'll be fine." The next morning, she woke to find Lucas already loading the wagon with tools and supplies. Evan was checking harnesses, his breath misting in the pre-dawn darkness. Marian had risen early to pack food for their journey, bread and cheese and dried meat, along with a tin of cookies she'd made the day before. Lucas accepted the basket with a nod of thanks, then paused. "You've got the rifle?" "In the pantry, like you showed me. And you know how to use it?" "I do." Lucas had insisted on teaching her shortly after the hearing, saying any woman alone on a ranch needed to know how to protect herself and the children. Marian had been a surprisingly good shot. "Good." Lucas hesitated, then added, "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you take the children and go to the Thorntons. Don't wait. Don't try to handle it yourself. Just go." "We'll be fine," Marian repeated, touched by his concern. Lucas looked like he wanted to say something else, but Evan was already climbing into the wagon. With a final nod, Lucas swung up beside his son, and they rolled down the drive into the fading darkness. Marian stood on the porch until the wagon disappeared from sight, then turned to find Rose pressed against her side. "I don't like when Pa leaves," the little girl said quietly. I know, sweetheart, but he'll be back soon. Marion took her hand. Come on, let's get you and your brothers some breakfast. The first day passed easily enough. Marion kept the children busy with their regular chores and lessons, and by evening they were all tired enough to go to bed without argument. But as Marion locked the doors and checked the windows, she felt the emptiness of the house in a way she never had before. It wasn't fear, exactly, just awareness. She was responsible now, truly responsible, for 3 young lives. If something went wrong, there was no Lucas to turn to, no Evan to help shoulder the burden. It was just her. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt oddly empowering. The second day brought unexpected challenges. One of the horses colicked, and Marion spent 2 hours walking the animal and massaging its belly the way Lucas had taught her, while Miles and Caleb took over caring for Rose. By the time the horse was better, Marion's arms ached, and her dress was covered in stable dirt, but she felt a fierce satisfaction at having handled the crisis without help. That evening, as she was preparing supper, Miles appeared in the kitchen doorway looking sheepish. Miss Marion? Caleb fell out of the hayloft. I think he hurt his arm. Marion's heart jumped, but she kept her voice calm. Show me. Caleb was sitting in the barn, his face pale, and his left arm cradled against his chest. When Marion gently examined it, he hissed in pain. Can you move your fingers? She asked. He wiggled them, wincing. Good. I don't think it's broken, but it's definitely sprained. Marion looked at Miles. Run to the house and bring me clean cloths and the tin of salve from the shelf above the wash basin, and fill a bowl with cold water from the pump. While Miles ran his errands, Marion sat with Caleb, keeping him calm and still. When Miles returned, she cleaned the scrapes on Caleb's arm, applied the salve Lucas kept for injuries, and wrapped the sprain carefully. You're going to be sore for a few days, she told Caleb. No climbing, no heavy lifting. Your brother can handle your chores. Yes, ma'am, Caleb said quietly. Then, you're good at this. Taking care of people. Marion smiled and ruffled his hair. I've had practice. Now come on, let's get some food in you. That'll help more than anything. That night, after the children were asleep, Marion sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and allowed herself to feel proud. She'd handled a sick horse and an injured child without panicking, without falling apart. She'd kept 3 children fed and safe and calm. She was doing more than earning her place here. She was proving, to herself as much as to anyone, that she belonged. The third day dawned gray and cold with the smell of snow in the air. Marion woke the children early, wanting to finish outdoor chores before the weather turned. They were bringing in the last of the firewood when Rose suddenly pointed toward the road. Someone's coming! Marion's hand instinctively went to her pocket, where she'd been keeping a small knife since Lucas left. But as the rider drew closer, she recognized James Thornton from the neighboring ranch. He pulled up near the porch, his expression serious. Miss Cross, is Lucas around? He's helping the Hargroves with their barn. Won't be back until tomorrow, probably. Is something wrong? Thornton dismounted, glancing at the children. Could we talk inside? Marion's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. Miles, take Rose and Caleb to gather eggs. I'll call you when it's time to come in. Once the children were occupied, Thornton followed Marion into the house. He stood awkwardly in the kitchen, turning his hat in his hands. There's been some trouble in town, he said finally. Franklin Morse was arrested yesterday. Turns out that investigation Judge Morrison ordered turned up evidence of fraud going back years. Morse was taking money from men for placements he never actually arranged and charging women for services he never provided. The territorial marshal got involved. Marion felt relief flood through her. That's good news, isn't it? Mostly. But here's the thing. Tommy Vickers is claiming he paid Morse $200 for your placement. Says he's owed either you or his money back. And since Morse is in jail, he's looking to you for satisfaction. That's absurd. I never agreed to anything with Vickers. I know that, and the law knows that. But Vickers is drunk most of the time these days, and he's been making threats. Sheriff wanted me to pass along a warning. Lucas should probably know, and you should be careful until this all gets sorted out. After Thornton left, Marion stood in the kitchen trying to calm the anxiety rising in her chest. She'd thought this was over, thought she was safe, but apparently the past wasn't quite finished with her yet. She spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened awareness, jumping at every sound, watching the road for riders that didn't come. The children sensed her tension and grew quiet, speaking in whispers and staying close to the house. That evening, as Marian was preparing supper, she heard horses. Multiple horses, moving fast. "Children, upstairs," she said quietly but firmly. "Now." "But," Miles started, "now." Something in her tone made them obey without further argument. Rose started to cry, but Caleb took her hand and led her toward the stairs. Miles hesitated at the bottom, clearly torn between obeying and staying to help. "Go," Marian said. "Lock yourselves in your room and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." She waited until she heard the door close upstairs, then retrieved the rifle from the pantry. Her hands were steady as she loaded it, muscle memory taking over. She positioned herself by the window where she could see the approaching riders without being easily seen herself. 3 men. One was definitely Tommy Vickers, swaying in his saddle even at a distance. The other 2 she didn't recognize, friends of his probably, or men he'd paid to back his play. They pulled up in this yard and Vickers dismounted with the exaggerated care of someone very drunk. He shouted toward the house, his words slurred but his intent clear. "Marian Cross, you come out here. We got business to settle." Marian opened the door but stayed behind it, the rifle held steady and ready. "Mr. Vickers, you're trespassing. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Vickers laughed, the sound ugly. "You gonna make me? You and what army?" "Me and this Winchester," Marian said calmly. "I'm a very good shot, Mr. Vickers. Mr. Hart made sure of that. Now, I'll ask one more time. Please leave this property." One of the other men leaned down to say something to Vickers, but Vickers shook him off. "I paid good money for you, $200. You think you can just—" "You paid money to a criminal who made you promises he had no right to make," Marian interrupted. "That's between you and Mr. Morse. It has nothing to do with me." "The hell it doesn't?" Marian raised the rifle slightly, enough that Vickers could see it clearly. "I don't want to shoot you, Mr. Vickers, but I will protect this property and the children in my care. You need to leave. Right now." For a long moment, they stood in a tense standoff. Then one of the other men said something low and urgent, and Vickers seemed to deflate slightly. He glared at Marian with bleary eyes, but he remounted his horse. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Marian replied. "Go home, Mr. Vickers. Sleep it off, and don't come back here." They rode off, Vickers cursing and the others trying to quiet him. Marian stood in the doorway until they were out of sight, then carefully lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline catching up with her. "Miss Marian?" Miles's voice came from behind her, small and frightened. She turned to find all 3 children on the stairs, Rose crying silently, and the boys pale, but trying to be brave. "It's all right," Marian said, setting the rifle aside and going to them. "They're gone. Everything's all right." Rose launched herself at Marian, wrapping her arms around her waist and sobbing. Marian held her close, gesturing for the boys to come closer too. They stood together in a tight knot, and Marian felt her own heart rate slowly returning to normal. "You were so brave," Miles whispered. "You didn't even look scared." "I was terrified," Marian admitted. "But sometimes being brave means doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared. And I needed to protect you. That was more important than being afraid." That night, she let all 3 children sleep in the main room by the fire, making pallets from blankets and staying awake herself to keep watch, just in case. But Vickers didn't return. When Lucas and Evan rode up the next afternoon, Marian was hanging laundry in the yard. She heard the wagon and turned, and something in her face must have shown because Lucas was off the seat and striding toward her before Evan had even set the brake. "What happened?" he demanded. Marian told him everything, Thornton's warning, Vickers' visit, how she'd handled it. Lucas's expression grew darker with every word, but when she finished, he surprised her. "You did exactly right," he said quietly. "You kept the children safe. You didn't back down, and you didn't shoot unless you had to. I'm proud of you." The words hit Marian harder than she expected. Proud. When was the last time anyone had said that to her? "I was so scared," she admitted. "The whole time I was terrified I'd do something wrong, that someone would get hurt." But they didn't. You handled it. Lucas paused, then added, I'm sorry I wasn't here. You were where you needed to be, and I was where I needed to be. Marion managed a smile. We managed just fine. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Lucas made a trip into town. He returned late, but his expression was satisfied. Sheriff arrested Vickers for trespassing and threatening behavior, he reported. He'll spend a few days in jail sobering up, and when he gets out, he'll have a restraining order keeping him away from this property and you specifically. If he violates it, he goes back to jail. This time, it really is over. Marion let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Thank you. Stop thanking me. You're part of this family, Marion. Protecting you is the same as protecting any of the kids. It's not something that needs thanks. It's just what we do. Part of this family. The words echoed in Marion's mind long after Lucas had gone to bed. The incident with Vickers seemed to mark a turning point. The children's acceptance of Marion deepened from tolerance to something more genuine. Rose started calling her Miss Mary and began asking her opinion on everything from what dress to wear to what stories were best for bedtime. Miles and Caleb competed for her attention at meals, each trying to tell her about their day first. And Evan, reserved Evan, started seeking her out for conversations that had nothing to do with chores or reading lessons. One evening, he found her mending socks in the kitchen and sat down across from her. Can I ask you something? He said. Always. Do you miss your old life in Philadelphia? Marion considered the question carefully. I miss some parts of it. I had a friend there, Mrs. Chen, who owned the boarding house where I lived. She was kind to me. I miss her. But not the rest? The rest was just existing. I worked, I paid my rent, I went to sleep and woke up and did it all again. It wasn't really living. Evan nodded slowly. Ma used to say that living and surviving weren't the same thing. She said surviving was just getting through each day, but living was finding reasons to be glad you did. Your mother was a wise woman. She would have liked you, Evan said quietly. I think you would have been friends. The simple statement brought tears to Marion's eyes. She reached across the table and squeezed Evan's hand, and he didn't pull away. As November turned toward December, the first snow came. Marion woke one morning to find the world transformed, everything covered in a blanket of white that made the landscape look soft and new. The children were beside themselves with excitement, and even Lucas smiled at their enthusiasm as they rushed outside to play. Marion stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, and watched them. Miles and Caleb were already building something that might have been a snowman or might have been a fort. It was hard to tell. Rose was making snow angels, her delighted laughter ringing clear in the cold air. And Evan, trying to maintain his teenage dignity, was nevertheless engaged in a snowball fight with his brothers. Lucas came to stand beside Marion, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered her one, and they stood together in comfortable silence. First snow of the season, he observed. Always feels like a beginning somehow. Does it? Marion took a sip of coffee, savoring the warmth. Sarah used to love the first snow. Said it made everything clean and new, gave you a chance to start fresh. He paused. I think she'd be happy seeing the kids like this. Happy again. You've done a wonderful job with them. They're good children. We've done a good job, Lucas corrected gently. You've been as much a part of raising them these past months as I have. Maybe more, in some ways. Marion felt warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee spreading through her chest. They're easy to love. They love you too. Maybe you haven't noticed, but they do. Rose tells everyone in town about her Miss Mari. The boys actually do their chores without being reminded because they know you'll notice and say you're proud of them. And Evan, Lucas shook his head with a small smile. Evan defends you like you're his own blood. Heard him arguing with some boys in town who said something disrespectful about you being a mail-order bride who didn't work out. He gave them a piece of his mind they won't forget soon. He did? He did. Because to him, you're not just the woman who helps around the house. You're family. They all feel that way. And you? The question slipped out before Marion could stop it. How do you feel? Lucas turned to look at her fully, his expression serious. I feel like the day I drove into that alley might have been the luckiest day of my life. I feel like you've brought something back to this house that I thought we'd lost forever. And I feel like I want you to stay, not because we need the help, but because this family isn't complete without you." Marion's breath caught. Before she could respond, Rose came running up, snow covering her from head to toe. "Miss Mari, come make angels with me." The moment broke, but the words hung in the air between them. Marion set down her coffee and let Rose pull her into the snow, and if her heart was beating faster than usual, if her cheeks were flushed with more than cold, she told herself it was just the excitement of the season. But that night, lying in her small room, Marion thought about Lucas's words, about family and belonging and completeness, about the way he'd said, "I want you to stay," like it was the most natural thing in the world. And she thought about how, somewhere along the way, without her quite noticing, this had stopped being a temporary situation and started being home. The winter deepened around them like a cocoon, wrapping the ranch in layers of white and cold that somehow made the warmth inside feel more precious. December brought shorter days and longer nights, and with them a closeness that felt both natural and significant. The family gathered around the fire in the evenings, the children doing lessons or playing quiet games while Lucas worked on accounts and Marion mended or knitted. It felt like they'd always been this way, like there had never been a time when Marion wasn't part of this constellation of lives orbiting each other in comfortable rhythm. But beneath the surface calm, something was shifting. Marion felt it in the way Lucas's eyes followed her across a room, in the careful way he never touched her unless necessary, in the charged silence that sometimes fell between them when they were alone. She felt it in her own racing heart when he smiled at her, in the way she caught herself watching him work, in the strange flutter in her stomach when he said her name. She was falling in love with him. The realization came one evening as she watched him teach Caleb how to whittle. His hands were patient and sure, guiding the boy's smaller fingers, his voice low and encouraging. The firelight caught in his hair and softened the hard lines of his face, and Marion thought, with startling clarity, that she would be content to spend the rest of her life watching exactly this, Lucas being a father, being kind, being himself. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it settled over her like a blessing. But she didn't know what to do with it. Lucas had offered her safety and employment, family and home, but never anything more. He'd made it clear she was free to leave whenever she chose, which meant he wasn't trying to trap her into anything. And maybe that was all he wanted, help with the house and the children, someone to ease the burden of running the ranch alone. Maybe the warmth in his eyes was just gratitude, nothing more. Christmas approached, and with it came preparations that filled the house with new energy. Rose talked of nothing but what presents she hoped to receive, while Miles and Caleb argued good-naturedly about whether they'd have snow deep enough for sledding. Even Evan seemed lighter, younger, caught up in the anticipation. "Ma always made Christmas special," he told Marion one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen. "Even when we didn't have much, she'd find ways to make it feel magical. Decorations from pine branches, special foods, little surprises hidden around the house." "We could do some of that," Marion suggested gently. "If you'd like. If it wouldn't be too painful." Evan considered this, then nodded. "I think Ma would want us to. She always said traditions were how you kept people alive in your heart." So they made preparations. Marion and the children spent an afternoon gathering pine boughs and holly, fashioning them into wreaths and garlands that filled the house with the sharp, clean scent of winter forest. She taught them how to string popcorn and cranberries for the small tree Lucas brought in from the far pasture. They baked cookies using Sarah's recipes, and the house filled with the smells of cinnamon and ginger and butter. Lucas watched these activities with an expression Marion couldn't quite read, something between joy and sorrow, present and past blending together in his eyes. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, he found Marion in the kitchen rolling out dough for more cookies. "Thank you for this," he said quietly, "for bringing this back to them, to us. They deserved it. Every child deserves a little magic at Christmas." Lucas moved closer, his hand reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, then dropping back to his side. "It's not just about the children, though, is it? You've put your whole heart into this, into them, into—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Into making this a home again." "It is home," Marion said simply. "For me, I mean. It's become home." "Good." Lucas's voice was rough. That's good." He left quickly after that, and Marion stood alone in the kitchen wondering what he'd been about to say, what words had caught in his throat and refused to come out. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and temperatures cold enough to make breathing painful. But inside the house, everything was warm and bright. They had a special dinner, roast chicken and potatoes and all the treats they'd been making for days. The children were wild with excitement, barely able to sit still through the meal. After dinner, they gathered in the front room where the tree stood decorated with their handmade ornaments. Lucas read aloud from a book of winter stories while the children listened with rapt attention. Rose fell asleep against Marion's shoulder halfway through, and when the story ended, Lucas carried her to bed while Marion herded the boys upstairs. When she came back down, Lucas was standing by the tree, looking at something in his hands. He turned when he heard her, and she saw it was a small wooden ornament, a star, carved with delicate precision. "Sarah made this our first Christmas together," he said softly. "I was going to hang it, but I wanted to ask, would it bother you, having reminders of her everywhere?" Marion moved closer, looking at the star. It was beautiful, clearly made with love and care. "Lucas, Sarah was your wife. She was the children's mother. She built this home with you. Why would I want to erase that?" "Some women would. Some women would want to replace her, start fresh, not live in the shadow of someone else." "I'm not trying to replace her. I could never replace her." Marion met his eyes. "I'm just trying to be myself here, with all of you. If that means living alongside Sarah's memory, I'm honored to do it. She sounds like she was an amazing woman." Lucas's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "She was. But so are you, Marion, in completely different ways, but just as amazing." He hung the star at the top of the tree, and they stood together looking at it. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and outside the wind whispered against the windows. "I need to tell you something," Lucas said abruptly. "I've been trying to find the right time, the right words, but there isn't a right time, and I don't have the right words, so I'm just going to say it plain." Marion's heart began to pound. "All right. When I saw you in that alley, I thought I was just helping someone in need, doing the right thing, like anyone should. But these past months, having you here, watching you with the children, seeing you become part of our lives, it's become so much more than that." He turned to face her fully. "You've become so much more than that." "Lucas, let me finish. Please." He took a breath. "I know the circumstances that brought you here weren't what you planned. I know you came to Wyoming looking for one kind of life and found something completely different. And I know I have no right to ask for more than you've already given us. But I'm asking anyway." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and slightly rough against hers. "Marry me, Marion. Not because you owe me anything, or because you need security, or because there's any kind of obligation. Marry me because I've fallen in love with you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made us. Marry me because when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you in it." Marion felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "You love me." "I love you. I think I started falling the moment you stood up to Morrison Vickers, all dignity and strength, even when you had nothing. I fell harder watching you with Rose, with all the kids, seeing how naturally you loved them, even when you had no reason to. And I fell completely somewhere in the middle of all these ordinary days, these simple moments of just living life together." "I love you too," Marion whispered. "I didn't know if I should, if I could, but I do. I love you, and I love your children, and I love this life we've built. But Lucas, are you sure? I'm not Sarah. I'll never be Sarah. I don't want you to be Sarah. I want you to be Marion, brave, kind, stubborn Marion, who makes the best apple pie I've ever tasted, and who can outshoot half the men in the county, and who taught my son to love reading again. That's who I want to marry. That's who I love." Marion laughed through her tears. "Then yes. Yes, I'll marry you." Lucas pulled her close, and she went willingly, fitting against him like she'd been made for exactly this space. He held her for a long moment, his face buried in her hair, and she felt him trembling slightly. "I was terrified you'd say no," he admitted. "I was terrified you'd never ask." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, and then he kissed her, gentle and careful and full of promise. Marion kissed him back, tasting salt from her tears and feeling something in her chest crack open and bloom like spring flowers pushing through snow. When they finally separated, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. The children are going to be impossible tomorrow. Rose has been asking me when I was going to marry you since about 2 weeks after you arrived. Marian laughed. She has? She has. Very insistent about it. Said we were already acting like a family, so we might as well make it official. Lucas smiled. She's wiser than she has any right to be at 5 years old. They stayed up late that night, talking about everything and nothing, making plans, sharing dreams, simply being together in this new way. When Marian finally went to her room, it was nearly dawn, and she felt like she was floating. Christmas morning brought chaos in the best possible way. The children thundered down the stairs at first light, and their shouts of delight at the small presents under the tree, books and carved toys and new winter clothes, filled the house with joy. They were so caught up in their excitement that they didn't initially notice Lucas and Marian standing close together, hands clasped. But Evan noticed. He went very still, his eyes moving from their joined hands to their faces, and something like hope flickered across his features. "Pa," he said quietly. The other children stopped their playing and looked up. Lucas squeezed Marian's hand once, then spoke. "Kids, I have something to tell you. I've asked Miss Marian to marry me, and she said yes. If you all agree, because this is a decision that affects all of us, we'd like to become a real family, legal and official." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Rose shrieked with delight and launched herself at Marian, wrapping around her legs and shouting, "I knew it! I knew it! I told Caleb you were going to be our new mama!" Miles and Caleb whooped and danced around, and even Evan was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that transformed his serious young face into something bright and unguarded. "So we all agree?" Lucas asked, though the answer was obvious. "Yes!" came the chorus. Rose looked up at Marian with shining eyes. "Can I call you Mama now?" Marian's throat closed with emotion. She knelt down and pulled Rose into a proper hug. "If you want to, I'd be honored." "What about Ma, though?" Caleb asked, suddenly uncertain. "Our first Ma. Does this mean we have to forget her?" "Never," Marian said firmly, looking at each child in turn. "Your mother will always be your mother. She gave you life and loved you and helped make you who you are. I'm not here to replace her. I'm just here to love you too, in my own way. You can have both of us in your hearts. There's room enough for everyone." Evan came over then, and in a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, hugged Marian tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, "for choosing us, for staying." "Thank you for letting me," Marian whispered back. The rest of Christmas passed in a blur of happiness. They ate too much, played games, told stories, and basked in the warmth of being together. Lucas kept finding excuses to touch Marian, a hand on her back as he passed, fingers brushing hers as they worked side by side, stolen kisses when the children weren't looking. That evening, after the excitement had died down and the children were finally in bed, Marian and Lucas sat together on the porch despite the cold. The stars were impossibly bright, and the snow-covered land stretched out peaceful and silent. "When should we do it?" Lucas asked. "The wedding?" "Soon," Marian said. "I don't need a big ceremony, just something simple, with the children there." "New Year's Day," Lucas suggested. "Start the new year as we mean to go on, together." "Perfect." They were married on the first day of January in the small church in town, with just the children and a few close neighbors as witnesses. Marian wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric Lucas had bought as a Christmas gift, deep blue wool that brought out her eyes. Rose served as flower girl, scattering dried rose petals with solemn concentration. Evan stood beside his father, and Miles and Caleb sat in the front row, trying very hard to sit still. The ceremony was simple and brief, but when Lucas slipped a plain gold band on Marian's finger and promised to love and cherish her, she felt the weight and truth of those words settle into her bones. When she made her own promises, she meant every word. They were sealing something that had already been built over months of shared work and shared life, making official what had already become real in their hearts. After the ceremony, they returned to the ranch for a celebration meal. The neighbors had brought food, and the house filled with talk and laughter. But eventually the guests left, and it was just the 6 of them, a family, complete and whole. That night, as Marian tucked Rose into bed, the little girl grabbed her hand. "Mama? Yes, sweetheart? Are you happy?" Marian smiled. Happier than I ever thought possible. Good. Because we love you very much, all of us. I love all of you too, more than words can say. After Rose fell asleep, Marian made her way to the room she would now share with Lucas, the master bedroom that had once belonged to him and Sarah. Lucas had asked if she wanted to change anything about it, make it feel more like hers, but Marian had said no. It was perfect as it was, full of history and love and the echoes of the family that had been built here. Lucas was waiting for her, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking nervous in a way that made her love him even more. I never thought I'd have this again, he said as she closed the door behind her. A wife, a partner, someone to share everything with. Neither did I. Marian moved to stand in front of him. When I was sitting in that alley, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd used up all my chances at happiness, at belonging, at love. And now? Now I know it was just beginning. She reached out and touched his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. You saved my life that night, Lucas. Not just from Morse and Vickers, but from giving up. You reminded me that I was worth saving. You saved mine too, Lucas said, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. This house was just a place we existed in, going through the motions. You made it a home again, made us a family again. He pulled her down beside him, and they sat together in the quiet darkness. Two people who'd both known loss and loneliness, who'd both learned that sometimes the end of one story was just the beginning of another. The winter passed in a series of small, perfect moments. Mornings waking up beside Lucas, feeling the solid warmth of him and knowing he was hers. Evenings with all the children gathered close, reading or talking or just being together. The daily work of the ranch that felt less like labor and more like living, every task a thread in the tapestry of their shared life. In March, Lucas made a trip to town and came back with papers from the courthouse. He gathered the family in the kitchen and spread the documents on the table. I've done something, and I wanted you all to see it official, he said. These papers name Marian as the legal mother of all four of you. Not just my wife, but your mother in the eyes of the law, which means you're bound together not just by choice and love, but by every protection the law can offer. Evan looked down at the papers, his eyes scanning the formal language. When he looked up, his face was wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. We're really a family now, he said. Permanent. Forever. Forever, Lucas confirmed. Marian looked at each of their faces, Evan trying so hard to be grown up, but still just a boy who needed a mother. Miles and Caleb, rowdy and loving and loyal to their bones. Rose, sweet Rose, who'd claimed Marian as hers from almost the first moment. And Lucas, steady and strong and kind, who'd seen her when she was invisible and chosen her when she had nothing to offer but herself. I need to tell you all something, Marian said quietly. I want you to understand what this means to me, what you all mean to me. She took a breath, gathering her thoughts. I came to Wyoming as a mail-order bride because I was lonely and desperate and thought that being useful to someone was better than being alone. I thought I had to be chosen by a stranger, had to offer myself up like goods at market just for the chance to matter to someone. The children were very still, listening. But what I learned, what you all taught me, is that real family isn't about transactions or contracts or being sold to the highest bidder. Real family is about choosing each other every day in 1,000 small ways. It's about staying when things get hard. It's about loving each other, not because you have to, but because you want to. Marian's voice broke, but she continued. I wasn't rescued from that alley. I was chosen. And not just once, but over and over again, every time one of you included me in your lives, every time you trusted me with your hurt or your joy, every time you called me family. That choosing, that being chosen, changed everything. Lucas reached over and took her hand, and the children gathered closer, creating a tight circle of belonging. So yes, Marian finished, we're a family, permanent and forever, and I am the luckiest woman in the world because of it. Spring came, bringing green shoots pushing through the last of the snow, and with it came a sense of renewal. One warm evening in April, Marian stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. Lucas came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different my life is now from what I imagined it would be. About how much better it is." "Any regrets?" "Not a single one." Marion leaned into him, watching Rose try to teach her brothers how to make daisy chains. "Well, maybe one." Lucas tensed slightly. "What's that?" "I regret that I can't go back and tell the woman sitting in that alley what's waiting for her. Tell her that the worst night of her life is about to become the doorway to the best life she could imagine." Marion smiled. "But I suppose she had to go through that darkness to appreciate the light." "We both did," Lucas said softly. "Lost our way, lost people we loved, lost faith that anything could ever be good again, and then found each other." They stood together as the sun slipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. Inside the house, the lamplight glowed warm and welcoming. The children's voices rose and fell in the rhythm of play and happiness. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called. This was home. Not the place she'd been promised by a stranger's advertisement, not the desperate grasping for security she'd thought she needed. This was real, messy and beautiful, and earned through showing up day after day, through choosing and being chosen, through love that grew from shared work and shared life. Marion Cross Hart had come to Wyoming with nothing but a carpetbag and fading hope. She'd been rejected, stolen from, threatened, and nearly broken. But she'd also been seen, protected, valued, and ultimately loved. She'd been sold like cattle and abandoned like trash. And then a cowboy had said 4 simple words that changed everything. "Get up, you're coming home." And she had. She'd gotten up, she'd come home, and in doing so, she'd found something more precious than she'd ever dared to dream. Not just shelter or security, but belonging. Not just a roof over her head, but a place in hearts that would hold her forever. She'd been chosen, and this time, the home she'd stepped into had chosen her back. That made all the difference.